This is Carolina Haints. Carolina Haints presents Folk, a show about our stories. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. For today's story, we're visiting Bluff Mountain in beautiful Ashe County. Once upon a time, there was a farmer on the mountain named John Krebs, as the legend goes. Early one morning, John was out looking for some lost calves. The morning started as a typical, chilly, foggy morning on the mountain. But as John continued to search the woods surrounding his farm, the terrain got tougher and tougher to traverse. He couldn't help but notice the fog had gotten heavier and heavier. Before he knew it, John was lost. The fog was so strong, he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. John began hearing a rustling nearby and thought he had eventually stumbled across his missing calves. He slowly stepped toward the sound until he was cut off by a blast of heat and a bright light, which disappeared just as fast as it appeared. John couldn't help but cough at the thick smell of sulfur that wafted into his face from seemingly nowhere. He began to panic. John had lived on this farm and walked in its woods all his life. He had never encountered anything like this. He instinctively understood that what he was experiencing was unnatural. He tried telling himself that he was still close to home, to relax and simply breathe, until his path was blocked by a tall, dark figure standing directly in front of him. His fear became palpable. The feeling of dread and pure evil permeated the fog.
"You know who I am,"
the figure said. John made the sign of the cross over his chest. "Yes, sir, I think I know who you are," John said, mustering all the bravery he had. After a long pause, the dark figure said softly,
"Bluff Mountain is mine. If you ever speak of this to anyone, your days will be numbered, and your soul will belong to me."
"Numbered how?" John asked.
3 days,
he replied. Suddenly, John could see the slightest path through the fog behind him. He wasn't sure he was excused, but he turned back to look at the dark figure, and it was gone. Well, John didn't need a formal invitation. He ran down the pathway as fast as his legs would take him. John had never experienced terror like this. As he approached the farmhouse, tripping over his own feet, gasping for air, John's wife came running out of the house to see what was the matter. He collapsed in her arms. She had never seen John like this, and it terrified her too. She noticed something was wildly different about John. His hair had turned inexplicably white.
"What happened to your hair?"
his wife demanded. John just stared at her, his wide, teary eyes wild with fear.
"What about the calves?"
his wife asked as she looked in that direction. "No!" John shouted. "The devil's in them woods!" He stared into her eyes in a way that let her know he wasn't fooling around. Then he fainted. After John awoke later that evening, he refused to close his eyes again. He stared straight forward, never talking, never moving. His wife had to milk the cows herself. The most she could get John to do was simply sit in his favorite rocking chair on the front porch. She never found the pair of calves that wandered off. It was as if they simply vanished from the mountain. After the third day of this routine, she came back to the house to check on John, carrying 2 full pails of milk. When she saw him, she knew something was wrong. His eyes were finally closed. Just as the devil told him. After 3 days, John sat on his porch, dead. Where his soul is, no one knows. This podcast is brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and Carolina Haints Incorporated, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting folklore storytelling throughout the Carolinas. You can learn more about us, including our book, Legends and Lore Markers, and upcoming tour dates on our website, carolinahaints.com. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Tune in then to keep this storytelling tradition alive.